If you open an atlas from 1980, you will see something that looks eternal. You will see the union of Soviet Socialist republics painted in red, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, covering 11 time zones and 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. You will see a superpower, with 40,000 nuclear warheads aimed at every major city in the West. You will see an empire that commanded armies in Afghanistan, Cuba, Angola, and Vietnam. To the politicians in Washington and the journalists in London, the Soviet Union looked like a permanent feature of the world. It looked like Goliath. But if you could have walked into the secret offices of the Soviet Ministry of Finance in Moscow, if you could have looked at the classified ledgers that tracked the flow of money in and out of the communist system, you would have seen something very different. You would have seen an empire built on quicksand. You would have seen a superpower that was dependent on a single commodity to survive. And you would have realized that the mighty Soviet bear was not a predator. It was an addict. The drug was oil. And in the 1980s, two men in two different deserts were about to cut off the supply. For most of its history, the Soviet Union presented itself as an industrial colossus. It was supposed to be proof that communist planning could outproduce capitalist chaos. Soviet propaganda showed factories churning out tractors and steel beams. It showed dams generating electricity. It showed a modern scientific state. But by the 1970s, the propaganda had become a lie. The Soviet economy was broken. The factories were outdated. The technology was decades behind the West. The collective farms could barely feed the population. When American wheat harvests failed in 1972, the Soviets had to import grain from their capitalist enemies just to avoid famine. It was humiliating. The entire communist experiment was failing. But then something miraculous happened. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo sent global oil prices skyrocketing. Overnight, crude went from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel. The Soviet Union, which sat on top of massive oil and gas reserves in Siberia, suddenly became rich. Hard currency poured into Moscow. Billions of dollars, pounds, and Deutsche Marks flooded the Kremlin's coffers. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. The aging leaders of the Politburo used that oil money to buy everything they couldn't produce themselves. They bought wheat from America and Canada. They bought technology from Europe. They bought luxury goods to keep the elite happy. And most importantly, they used the money to fund a massive military buildup. They built more tanks, more missiles, more submarines. They propped up communist regimes around the world. As long as the oil price stayed high, the illusion of Soviet strength could continue. The party leaders convinced themselves that the good times would last forever. They built their budgets on the assumption that oil would always be expensive. They did not realize they had become a petro-state. They did not realize that their fate was now tied to the global price of a single commodity. And they certainly did not realize that their enemies were watching. In January 1981, Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as President of the United States. He brought with him a new philosophy toward the Soviet Union. For decades, American policy had been containment. The goal was to prevent Soviet expansion, but accept that the USSR would exist indefinitely. Reagan rejected this. He believed the Soviet Union was weak and could be defeated. He surrounded himself with hardliners who shared this view. Among them was William Casey, the new director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Casey was not a typical spy. He was an old Wall Street lawyer who had served in the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. He understood that wars were not just won on battlefields. They were won in boardrooms and bank vaults. He looked at the Soviet Union not as a military problem, but as a financial problem. Shortly after taking office, Casey ordered the CIA to conduct a comprehensive study of the Soviet economy. He wanted to know where the money came from and where it went. The report that landed on his desk several months later was a revelation. It showed that up to 80% of the Soviet Union's hard currency came from oil and natural gas exports. It showed that the entire system depended on keeping energy prices high. If the price of oil dropped significantly, the Soviet budget would collapse. The military would have to be cut. The subsidies to Eastern Europe would have to stop. The whole empire would be in crisis. Casey read the report and realized he had found the pressure point. If he could drive down the price of oil, he could bankrupt the Soviet Union without firing a shot. But there was a problem. The United States was a buyer of oil, not a seller. America couldn't lower the global price alone. To crash the market, Casey needed a partner. He needed a country with so much oil that it could flood the world and drown the Soviet economy in oversupply. He needed Saudi Arabia. The relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia in the early 1980s was complex. The Saudis were fabulously wealthy from oil revenues. They controlled OPEC, the cartel of oil-producing nations that set production quotas. High oil prices made the Saudis rich. Why would they agree to lower prices just to help America fight the Russians? Casey knew he needed leverage. He needed to offer the Saudis something they valued more than money. He needed to offer them security. The Middle East in the early 80s was dangerous. The Iranian Revolution had overthrown the Shah and installed a radical Islamic government hostile to the Saudi monarchy. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan and were creeping closer to the Persian Gulf. The Saudi royal family was terrified. They saw enemies everywhere. William Casey flew to Riyadh to meet with the Saudi leadership in secret. The details of those meetings remain classified to this day. There are no transcripts, there are no recordings, but we can reconstruct what happened from what came next. Casey painted a picture of the Soviet threat. He showed the Saudis maps of Soviet expansion in the region. He argued that Moscow was encircling the oil fields. He warned that if the Soviets gained control of the Gulf, the House of Saud would fall. Then he made his offer. The United States would provide total military protection to Saudi Arabia. They would sell them advanced weapons. They would deploy American forces if necessary. They would guarantee the survival of the kingdom. In exchange, Casey asked for one thing: open the taps, flood the market with oil, drive the price down, bankrupt Moscow. At first, the Saudis hesitated. Lowering oil prices would hurt their own revenues. But Casey made a compelling argument. It was better to be a secure ally of the United States with slightly less money than a wealthy target of Soviet aggression. He also appealed to religion. The Soviets were killing Muslims in Afghanistan. By destroying the Soviet economy, the Saudis would be defending Islam. The arguments worked. The deal was struck. It was a financial assassination plot hatched in a desert palace. While Casey was negotiating with the Saudis, the Reagan administration was launching other attacks on the Soviet economy. They pressured European allies to stop lending money to Moscow. They blocked the construction of a massive natural gas pipeline from Siberia to Western Europe that would have earned the Soviets billions. They forced the Soviets to spend more and more on defense by launching an expensive arms race. The goal was to stretch the Soviet budget to breaking point, so that when the oil shock came, the system would shatter. By 1985, the trap was set. In Moscow, a new leader had risen to power. Mikhail Gorbachev was younger and more dynamic than his predecessors. He knew the Soviet economy was struggling. He launched a reform program called perestroika, or restructuring. He planned to modernize industry, improve efficiency, and make the system work. But Gorbachev made a fatal assumption. He assumed the oil money would keep flowing. His entire budget was based on oil staying at $30 a barrel or higher. He believed he had a financial cushion. He did not know that William Casey and the Saudis had already cut the rope. In the summer of 1985, Saudi Arabia changed its oil policy. For years, the Saudis had acted as the swing producer in OPEC. They cut their own production to keep prices high for everyone else. They were tired of this role. Other countries were cheating on their quotas and pumping more oil while Saudi Arabia held back. In September, Saudi oil minister Ahmed Zaki Yamani announced that the kingdom would no longer defend the price. Instead, they would fight for market share. It sounded like technical jargon, but in the trading rooms of New York and London, everyone understood. It meant war. The Saudis opened the valves. They had massive surplus capacity that had been sitting idle. Within weeks, they flooded the market with millions of extra barrels every day. The world was suddenly drowning in oil. Supply exceeded demand by a huge margin. The laws of economics took over with brutal efficiency. The price began to fall. $30 became $28, then $25, then $20. In Moscow, the initial reaction was confusion. Soviet planners had seen price fluctuations before. They assumed this was temporary. They assumed the market would correct itself. They kept spending money as if nothing had changed. They kept fighting the war in Afghanistan. They kept subsidizing their satellite states in Eastern Europe. They kept buying grain from the West. They were burning through their hard currency reserves, waiting for the oil price to recover. But it never did. It kept falling. By early 1986, the price of oil had crashed to $10 a barrel. It was one of the lowest prices in modern history. Every dollar drop in the oil price cost the Soviet Union roughly $1 billion in annual revenue. At $10 a barrel, they had lost $20 billion a year. That was money they needed desperately. The Soviet Union could not feed itself. The inefficiency of collective agriculture meant they had to import wheat from America and Canada. They had to pay in hard currency because nobody wanted rubles. When the oil money disappeared, the food supply was threatened. The panic in the Kremlin was real. Gorbachev received secret memos from his finance ministers warning that the treasury was empty. They could not afford to import the machinery needed for modernization. They might have to cut imports of consumer goods. The Soviet people had been promised a better life under perestroika. Now they were being told there was no money. Then disaster struck. In April 1986, the nuclear reactor at Chernobyl exploded. The catastrophe cost billions in cleanup and relocation. It was a massive, unexpected expense at the exact moment their income had vanished. It was a perfect storm. The Americans kept the pressure on. They encouraged the Saudis to maintain low prices. They told them this was hurting the common enemy. The Saudis, who had massive financial reserves built up over decades, could afford to take the hit temporarily. They kept pumping. At $10 a barrel, it cost the Soviets more to extract oil from the frozen fields of Siberia than they could sell it for. Their greatest asset had become a liability. The psychological impact on the Soviet elite was devastating. For decades, they had believed that history was on their side. They believed capitalism was weak and doomed to fail. Now they were learning a harsh lesson in market economics. Their entire system was built on the luck of high oil prices. Without that luck, they had nothing. The confidence of the Communist Party began to crack. Hardliners blamed Gorbachev, reformers blamed the hardliners. But neither side could solve the fundamental problem. They were bankrupt. The financial crisis triggered a chain reaction across the empire. For decades, the Soviet Union had subsidized Eastern Europe. They sold cheap oil to East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. They provided direct financial aid. This was the glue that held the Warsaw Pact together. When the money ran out, the subsidies stopped. Gorbachev had to tell the leaders of Eastern Europe that Moscow could no longer support them. He called it the Sinatra Doctrine, meaning they could do it their way. He did not do this because he believed in freedom. He did it because he was broke. When the people of Eastern Europe realized that Soviet tanks would not come because the Soviets could not afford the fuel, they rose up. The revolutions of 1989 were powered by the spirit of liberty, but they were made possible by the bankruptcy of the oppressor. The collapse was swift. By 1989, the Soviet Union was selling off its gold reserves just to buy wheat. It was a fire sale. They were liquidating assets to pay the grocery bill. Gorbachev was forced to cut military spending. For the first time in Soviet history, defense was not the top priority. He ordered withdrawal from Afghanistan not because the war was unwinnable, but because it was unaffordable. When the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, Soviet guards stood down. They stood down because orders from Moscow were to do nothing. And those orders came because Moscow could not afford to do anything. At $30 a barrel, the tanks might have rolled as they had in Hungary in '56 and Prague in '68. But at $10 a barrel, the tanks stayed in the barracks. The Soviet Union formally dissolved on December 26, 1991. The red flag came down from the Kremlin for the last time. Historians talked about the triumph of democracy and the failure of communist ideology. Those things were true. But the man who turned off the lights was not just Reagan or Gorbachev or the Pope. It was also the Saudi oil minister who opened the taps in 1985. It was the invisible hand of the market, manipulated by a secret deal in the desert. The oil weapon was silent. It did not destroy buildings. It did not kill soldiers. It destroyed balance sheets. It hollowed out the state from within. It turned a superpower into a beggar. The lesson remains. Empires built on resources rather than innovation are built on sand. When the commodity price crashes, the empire crashes. The Soviet Union had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world 10 times over, but it could not buy bread. It was a giant with armor of steel and feet of clay. When the oil slick spread beneath it, the giant slipped and never rose again. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a bounced check.